Hello. Welcome, which promises to be quite a lively panel. My name is Teresa Carrigal. I am the CEO of a company called Achieve Unite. Informa is one of my most trusted, and the man sitting up here is an incredible leader of the organization, and there's a couple other Informa members here. So, Art Whitman, I'm going to introduce the three of them, and I'm excited to introduce all three of them. So, Art Whitman, he's a very humble man. He leads this group at Informa, and he always says they all know more than he does. But you saw him on stage, right? And he gave one of the best talks of the whole conference. So thank you, Art. Thank you for your amazing thought leadership, and you build a great team with your people. So welcome. Art's going to be interviewing. I know. And then next is, dun, 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 John Cunningham, the CEO of BCM1. He actually started the company in 1992. He's seen it all. He's rolled up 4 companies to make BCM1. So I think you're going to hear some really interesting things from him today. And then Karen Fields, who's the CEO of Microcorp. And Karen has an incredible culture in her organization where people feel like they're family. They feel like they're so committed to the company and what they're building. So she's going to tell you about how she's built that and what she's done. So take it away, Art.
Okay, so I also think Karen was a CP360 winner last night. So congratulations on that. What we're going to do today is just break our time into 4 chunks here, and we're going to talk about cloud and digital transformation first. Then we're going to talk a little bit about SD-WAN, since I know it's a very important topic to everybody in the room. We're going to touch on security next, and then finally a little bit about the business of being in the channel. So that's what we've agreed to talk about. I have some very general questions here, which hopefully will lead to very specific answers. If you want to add into the conversation, have a question or anything, just raise your hand. I'll repeat the question back so that the film crew gets it, and we'll include you in the conversation as we go. So that's our ground rules, and let's get on to it. So cloud. I'm going to make this really general. Tell me what you think are the top trends that everybody should be aware of in terms of cloud adoption right now.
That they need to be in it.
Drop the mic.
I am so excited. Okay, I'm not trying to predate myself, but I've been in this industry 23 years, and I started when it was price per minute, and we were just selling local dial tone. And then about 13 years ago, MPLS came into play, and that was kind of new and exciting, and some of our partners didn't make that transition. This digital age, cloud, I am so excited about it. All the things that we can do, whether it's IoT, whether it's SD-WAN, but it's actually more even just software-defined network. It's not just the WAN. Security. I just think there's so much going on, and you need to find your passion, the thing that you think is really cool, and really invest your time in learning that one area, because you're never going to be able to be the expert across the board in all of it.
Good advice.
Great. When you look at cloud, it's such a big topic. I think you really have to kind of, and I'm aligned with Karen here, pick where you're going to sit. So if you really look back at the trends that are out in the marketplace that are driving businesses, I look at it as there are 3 major ones. The first is the increase in public cloud consumption. The second is the workforce becoming very mobile. And the third is the decrease in cost in IP transit. So if you look at those 3 things coming together, and just really to put it in perspective, in 2009, AWS had virtually no revenue. Now they have approximately $14 billion worth of revenue. Last year was the first year that internet access from devices exceeded from computers. And IP transit, as we all know, everybody sitting in this room has seen how the decrease in cost has been there. So when you look at cloud and where you are, I think it's really important to align yourself with these macro trends, because at the end of the day, all boats rise with high tide. So, when you look at something such as unified communication, it's much more mature than some of the other cloud services out there. So I think, cloud is difficult because it's so big, and you mentioned IoT, which is, kind of separate, and then how does that interrelate with mobility and everything else? I think you really do need to take it apart But big picture-wise with cloud, I think it's important to look at where the trends are and then participate in that to whatever degree you're going to participate in that, because all boats do rise with high tide.
Well, and I think that there is so much happening in each area right now that for our customers, it's really hard for them to even stay abreast of, UCaaS. I mean, the bells and whistles that we had 2 years ago are not even touching what they're now coming up with today when I look at companies like Nextiva and how they're really integrating all areas of how they communicate, including, social media and everything. I mean, it's getting so complicated that it's no one can keep up with all of it. It's,
I think that's a really important point, and one that we touched on earlier in the week, that what you're saying is exactly right. Network transport gets so cheap, it's basically free versus the problems that you're trying to solve, right? So bandwidth, if you think about it, is free historically, right? And what you said is the real problem that people have to get at, which is handling complexity for your customers, right? That's the whole deal that the cloud brings us, is the ability to handle complex things in a simple way. So can you talk about like how partners are being successful with their clients in terms of managing complexity, solving problems for them, and actually getting at business outcomes?
I'll jump on that one. Okay. So what's interesting is we get people calling us up, knocking down our doors saying we want to do training. We've got a great cloud product, we've got a great this product, UCaaS, whatever it might be, down to the, the nitty gritty in it. And there are a lot of sales folks out there that wrestle with, I'm concerned about having a security conversation, or I'm concerned about having, some sort of technical conversation because I'm not an expert in it. Actually, in my opinion, it's easier now because all conversations are business conversations, right? What we see in the marketplace is clients want to just solve problems, right? They want to outsource technology and just have technology work. They don't want to know the nitty-gritty, of those different services. And then you layer on things that are important, such as governance. And when you talk about cloud, like we all think about, okay, how can we, sell a cloud product and make money off of that? But a lot of the problems that cloud creates, such as how do we govern that environment? What are the compliance issues associated with that? How do I control the spend and know where my inventory is because it's not on my premises, so I can't get my arms around it? Those type of issues are just basic business issues out there that partners are uniquely qualified to solve. That's on top of, candidly, the pull-through services, which are the bandwidth and which are the actual, seats in a UCaaS or IaaS or whatever it might be. So it's a little bit of a different way to look at it. But the conversation is a business conversation, and most of the people in this room are business owners and know how to have that conversation. So to Karen's earlier point, having the conversation is the most important thing. You're not going to get into the weeds, into the bits and bytes. They don't want to go there.
See, and I agree, and I think it's also ecosystem. Our telecom partners are no longer the specialist that their customers are looking for them to be. They're now the internist, who then rely on a group of specialists that they have within their own ecosystem. And we're seeing that, and not only are our partners developing it within their own community of friends that they work, who are their their frenemies. They have someone who is the security specialist. They have somebody that they know is the UCaaS specialist. They have somebody that they know is this infrastructure specialist. They're just the internist for their customers to be able to talk about the high-level conversation of what's the business necessity, and then they're going out and they're pulling in the resources that they know from their own community to help guide those conversations. Because like just in the infrastructure space, they're not going to be able to learn everything that the specialists know in a session or two. I mean, they're going to have to spend years to get that knowledge. All they really need to know is that a customer has an infrastructure situation, they know who their specialist is, they walk arm in arm, and they bring the right solutions to their customers. For us, it's ecosystem, I think.
Another interesting point is, in the last 5 years, clients have drastically changed. It used to be, you'd walk in, you could identify, a problem that the client may not have known of. And then they're looking at you as a trusted advisor, and you could kind of move through that sales cycle. Now, 80% of the research frequently has been done by clients. They're smart, they've got the internet, they're looking at it. They're approaching partners in a totally different manner. The old way of going in and establishing credibility, initial benefit statement, history of the company, and going through that, they know what your company is doing. They're looking to kind of quickly get to the chase and find people who are going to help them solve problems. So I like the doctor analogy because no one expects anybody, even an engineer, and it's similar to going to a doctor. You have a general practitioner, but if you've got a blood problem, you're going to go to a specialist. If you've got a back problem, you're going to go to a specialist, et cetera. But someone needs to, keep the balance between those, because similar to healthcare, where it gets lost is if you're not managing your own healthcare, and those of you who have older parents and have been through it, those folks come in, they do their thing, and then they move to the next person. If someone's not managing that, it's a huge problem. And that's what we've all done forever for our clients. So I think we're in the best spot that we've ever been, that I've seen since doing this since 1992.
I agree.
Okay, so been in the business 23 years, started when you were 8 years old, precocious. You've seen so much change. How much time do you expect your people to spend on education versus being out in the field and working with clients?
It's really interesting. I think that they need to commit about 4 to 5 hours a week of educating themselves, whether it's going on a webinar, whether it's reading, whether it's seeing, going and seeing YouTube video clips, or being part of discussions with their peers about what their peers are experiencing, because you learn a lot from those informal conversations too. But it's something that you need to put on your calendar and you need to commit to every single week, because you're right, the customers are changing and the customers are way more knowledgeable. They've grown up always using the internet. They were playing video games with people in Japan when they were 8 years old. They were. So for them, their expectations of technology are a lot higher than somebody who, just started using a computer 20 years ago.
So just a show of hands, how many people would say they spend that 4 or 5 hours a week on education? All right.
Good for you.
Good job. And the rest of you are just out selling too much stuff? Making too much money to worry about it?
I look at it, I think the quality of the time that you spend is very, very important, right? Because, we work with a lot of different suppliers, there's a lot of different products, and everybody talks about product. And I watch people, in the past I did, because we do something a little bit differently, I've watched people leave meetings like, this is really cool, and then guess what happens? The real world intrudes, everyone puts their head down, they go do their job, 2 weeks go by, they're like, wow, Karen said something that was really interesting. I can't remember what it is because it wasn't applied. So one of the things that we've found that's been very successful is, one, simplicity. We come in and say, what are the 3 points that you want to get across to people, at the end of this? Let's state them up front. Secondly, what's the profile of the clients, right, that are going to basically consume your services? So if we know those profiles, we ask our sales folks to come in with some people that fit that profile so that they can have a specific conversation around it so that it ties it to them making money. And then secondly, after that, we request that, hey, listen, get a client on the phone and let's have a conversation, because the reality is we all learn best when we're in the process and there's money at the end of it, right? Education's great, you can learn a lot of stuff, but if you walk out and you go through an engagement and you're sitting next to someone who's going through SD-WAN or security or whatever it might be, and you're learning about it, you're going to know much more by going through that engagement, even if you don't get the deal. Hopefully you do get the deal, but you're practically using it. It's the same thing we see if you're going into computer programs. How often you go in and you're working on something, you don't do it for a month, you go back in, you're like, how do I navigate? So our approach is keep it simple with 3 things and then apply it immediately. Otherwise, people just forget about it, and the sheer volume of information that we're all trying to consume is staggering, so it needs to be purposeful. my opinion. So I agree, 4 hours is great, but it needs to be, you need to know what you're doing with it and actually act upon it quickly. Otherwise, we're all going to forget. Things go in one ear and out the other with me, and I'm like, what happened? You know?
Well, and also we all learn differently. Some people learn by doing, some people learn by reading, some people learn by having a conversation. I learn better by having a conversation with someone. So if I were to go out with a peer and sit down and have lunch and say, okay, tell me about one of your wins, and they walk through it, I actually learn better from that. It doesn't have to be attending a seminar, it doesn't have to be a webinar. It's how you learn best, but it's investing that time to sit down and have that conversation with somebody, because that would work best for me.
Okay, so we're going to have one more question here in the cloud area, and then we'll move on. One of the things cloud lets you do is sell services that are very much oriented towards line of business. So the customer that you're talking to can be different. It's not necessarily the technical guy at the company that you're talking to. So how do you have those conversations, and how often are you having those conversations? And how are they different than if you were talking to, say, the technical manager at the company?
Well, I'll jump in on that.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's interesting, right? So we all have LinkedIn. We all have contacts. So, you know, when you look at that cloud, for example, you really want to be speaking with the application owner. Right. Because practically speaking, the biggest problem, if you look at an IaaS, for example, is, okay, we've got something in place. The first question is, how much time and how much is it going to cost me, and how easy is it going to be for me to take it from where it is and move it into the cloud? How cloud ready is it? So now we got to do an assessment for cloud ready. The client then needs to say, okay, what's my risk associated with moving this workload? I need to get other people to buy in. There's a concern with it. It takes a long time, and it's very heavy lifting. If you go and speak to someone who owns an application, someone in marketing or someone in application development, those folks are doing greenfield. So they need to put it up. It's easier. So it's a much better approach. And we all know people that we probably don't even realize are doing that, whether it's through community, whether it's through church, whether it's through friends. So that's where I think LinkedIn and just having conversations like Karen's talking about, you know, we've all had conversations. It could be on an airplane or somewhere else. I actually, interestingly, had one on an airplane, and I typically don't speak on airplanes, with a gentleman, which ties in very tightly. And so you put these pieces together, and it's all about partnership. So I think it's critically important to have those conversations, and we all know people, and we know people that we don't even know we know, but it's the most important thing is once you're having the conversation, it's amazing what'll happen. But we want to get away from those folks who are traditionally talking to as it relates to cloud, because greenfield opportunities are going to close quick. There's budget for it already, and it's greenfield, much easier for us to get it through the system. And what are we all trying to do? You know, get the highest return on investment for our time, because that's the big challenge, is what we're spending time on.
Well, and do you find, or I find that a lot of our partners get really comfortable in talking to their customers about one or two things, but then they don't branch out and look at, so they'll talk about infrastructure and they're saying, okay, well, where are you going in your data center? What are you doing? But they then don't take the next step and go deeper into the conversation about, okay, storage. Okay, well, how do you want to store it? Do you want to have it in multiple locations? Let's talk about retrieval. You know, how quickly do you need to retrieve this information? Do you need to retrieve it in 30 seconds, or do you need to retrieve it in 30 days? You know, they're stopping the conversation at the point that they feel is comfortable, and they're not taking that little step to go just a little bit further. And you know, I don't know, a lot of people have gotten into this fear. You know, you gotta do something that makes you scared. That's one of the things. Go a little bit further. Ask the next question about the services that they're doing. Why are they doing it? What do they need it to do? There's a logical progression with the cloud when you're going into it of it's not just infrastructure, it's then all the different components that make it up.
Yeah.
One other point on that, which I think is interesting. When we talk about training and we talk about what we do, the art and skill of being a professional salesperson is what we need to focus on, right? Because it doesn't matter what we're selling, it's going to change, and the rate of change is increasing, and solutions are solutions. So I think it's important to focus on the skill and art, and many of the things that Karen spoke about are like part of Sales 101. Get out of your comfort zone. Make sure the client is out of their comfort zone, because if you've not made them uncomfortable, you truly haven't asked them to move forward in a process. And I think going back to the kind of that skill and art that we all have, as opposed to relying on, you know, a price point, for something that a client wants, we've all done this, creating opportunities that they didn't know exist. You create those by asking those more difficult questions. So I think that's an excellent point.
So actually, I have a funny story to tell. Our company, we do a program for our partners. It's called Ultimate Partner Training. And one of the things that we brought into it was Basic Sales Training 101. Now, we are talking to people who have been selling for 15, 20, 30 years. And we felt a little bit awkward about bringing in Basic Sales 101 training, but we're like, you know what? Let's go and invest an hour and a half in this. And they all failed. The group dynamic was asking open-ended questions. And so they had a couple of minutes to come up with coming up with a list of open-ended questions that they would ask a customer during initial conversation. They failed. 21 professionals failed. They could not come up with more than one or two questions, and oftentimes the two questions were basically the same question in just a different order. We don't go deeper. We don't remember the basic sales that we did when we were first starting out. We get into our routine. We get comfortable in what we're going to say. If it's in an industry that we work at a lot, we kind of already know what their pain points are, so we go in with this preset, almost speech in our head, and we're not necessarily listening, and we're not taking the time to do the basic 101 stuff that got us to where we are today. So I think that's very true.
And an interesting point on that
Sorry.
is if you ask, and we've probably all done this to some degree, if you ask someone who's not in sales, right, what do you think a salesperson does, you'll frequently get an answer such as, they get people to buy things that they really don't need. Right? You'll get that answer occasionally. And the reality, right, what a salesperson does and the value of a salesperson to a professional is it creates insightful thought and then helps to guide a consumer down the most appropriate path for them. And that consumer trusts that salesperson has their best interest at heart and understands how to navigate through this process, because it is a process, right? There's a buying process. It's very process oriented, and you have to go step A, step B, step C. And if someone hasn't digitally transformed, or they haven't migrated to the cloud, or they haven't deployed SD-WAN, they've never been through that process.
Right.
And we have. So what a salesperson does is help them make those educated decisions and give them the information necessary to make those decisions, because what do businesses do? It's all about managing risk. So they need to understand what the risks are associated and what the costs are, so then they can make a business decision as, well, okay, so now I understand what my risk is and what my cost is. It all comes down to insurance when you talk about disaster recovery and many of the things we speak of. Once they have that information, they make the decision, then we help to facilitate it through the process, and then it starts again with the next and the next and the next. And the rate of change that's happening right now, we're having constant conversations, and it's a dialogue that just continues to progress. And that's how we keep ourselves engaged in that conversation, and we're sitting aligned. So we sit at a level above the product sale and sitting right next to the client, helping them navigate through the complexity of this business we're all in. And the bits and bytes and the nuts and the bolts, there are people who know that, and we engage them, we bring them in.
Right.
And some of them, it makes sense, others it don't. It doesn't make sense for that solution, and we work through that process, and clients know it's a process.
Right. That's why we're the internist, and we then go and bring in the specialists that the customers need for that specific project.
So, best salesperson I've ever seen was a boss of mine that I've worked for a couple different times. And he would go into meetings with customers and had just a way about him where he could talk about what their business challenges were. And he would invariably get up to a whiteboard and start talking about their challenges and what we could do to fix their challenges. And by the end of it, he had them convinced that we would have some solution for them that would help them get at whatever they needed to get at. And I would sit there with this forced smile on my face, and we get out of the room, and I'm like, we don't make that, right? It's like, yeah, but we can. We never made so many custom products in my life, but he was incredibly good at sales and at finding out what people needed. So let's move on a little bit and talk about software-defined networking and SD-WAN. And again, pretty complicated topic.
Incredibly complicated.
How much do people need to know? Well, first of all, let's ask a question. How many of you are currently selling SD-WAN? How many of you would like to be and aren't? Okay, so basically we've got people who are doing it. How can they up their game? And this is an area where I'm not even sure what the right questions are to ask, so I'm going to turn it over to you guys, because these guys have an SD-WAN practice. What do you see as the things that people do best in their SD-WAN practices, and what are the challenges that come up?
I don't think that anybody has gotten to that point yet, because I think that it's so new. MPLS is a standard protocol. SD-WAN is not. Everybody does it differently. Big Leaf is a very different type of SD-WAN solution than Versa. And they're just completely different. We are in the infancy stage of the SD-WAN whole software. We're in the infancy stage. We're constantly going to be growing. We haven't even started. We have customers. We won 360 on a sale of 3,000 location. It's going to be initially a $1.5 million monthly MMR SD-WAN solution. It was a customer who you would not think of as being a risk taker, but they needed to do something to get more visibility, and they were willing to take the risk. Most of our partners who are selling SD-WAN will tell you they know nothing about it. That's what we're seeing. We're learning as we're growing. And I think in the next 3-4 years, we're going to start to see a lot more consistency. We have matrices of, all the different providers and whether, what services and bells and whistles they have, because even the providers themselves, if they're using Versa, they don't use all the same features and functionality that Versa has. So we're learning every day.
Yeah, as are we. What we've done is basically we've categorized it in, you have gateway SD-WAN, you have controller in the cloud SD-WAN, and you have premise-based SD-WAN. So the gateway are for folks that want real-time applications to quickly travel across the globe with low latency. Issues there are it's less secure because you've got to give your security keys to the SD-WAN provider. Premises-based generally is going to lend itself more to a security-oriented organization of folks that have control because it's right there, but it increases the level of complexity and you need to handle it. Cloud is exactly what all the other cloud services are, which is multi-tenant, some minor security issues. So that's where it starts. So where do you kind of, as a client, where do you see yourself sitting? Then what we're seeing is really what's the driver behind it. We've seen some large retailers reacting to a CFO or CEO saying, you got to cut costs by 35%. So they have to jump in, and this is a means for them to do it. Most of what we're seeing is they're replacing secondary networks. So let's say they have MPLS. They'll replace the secondary network with DIA or with the broadband in order to test it to cut that expense. And they're doing POCs and putting their toes in the water. What's interesting is, aside from the name SD-WAN, the technology's been around for a long time, right? Cisco, has been doing performance-based routing since really the 80s. So what's nice about it is it's not new. It's just the price points have come down. The challenges that we're seeing is, all these folks are popping up, and are they CapEx or are they OpEx, right? Most of these folks came from, whether it's EMC or Cisco, so they want to sell a CapEx model because they need to show top-line revenue. And we're not seeing people want to consume a CapEx model. So then, and the reality is, if you go to the VAR community, okay, if I take paper on an SD-WAN and then sell it to the client and it doesn't work, you have software costs, which you really have to factor that because there's no real property there. And then on the hardware, if it doesn't work, it's a paperweight. So it becomes very expensive to do that. So they're struggling with kind of the economic model associated with that. And then you've got the big carriers that are coming in who have the financial resources to deploy it. But then you get into this whole issue around, okay, so this is great. Now I have control. I can go active, so I'm using the bandwidth that I'm paying for, which is wonderful. I've got disaster recovery, but in order to appropriately use it, what I've done is I've taken these 2 layer 3 networks, and now I've got a bunch of, I'm going to pick whoever's lit in my individual facilities, and I'm going to back it up with broadband. So now I've got this kind of ecosystem of non-SLA product that I'm dealing with, because SD-WAN will tell you, okay, this is performing poorly, now you got to pick up the phone and call. So those are the issues that it creates, where I think partners can be very instrumental in solving that, where in a layer 3 environment, you don't have kind of that fallout on the back end. And I think people are, to a certain degree, aware of it. I think Gartner even actually wrote about it as a big issue. But I think partners play a key role in project managing the deployment of those services, as well as potentially helping in levels of escalation from a remediation and a candid response to say, okay, you've got all that great bandwidth, but there's no SLA associated with it.
Well, but also customers are saying that they want to manage their network, but then once they get it, they're like, I don't want to actually manage it. I want somebody else to manage it. And so they think that they want SD-WAN, but they want the intelligence and they want the analytics and they want to be able to lower their costs, but they don't necessarily always understand everything, all the pros and the cons, because there are some SD-WAN solutions that actually aren't cheaper, because by the time you get the bandwidth and you layer on the box, it doesn't really come out to be a save for the customer. Now, it gives them a lot more bang for the buck, but it's not necessarily a cost savings, which is sometimes the driver for the initial conversation. We had an SD-WAN summit with some of our top partners, and while there are early adapters, we have a lot more customers that are saying that they want to wait 18 months to see how everything's going to fall out and to learn more about what true SD-WAN is and the different functions and features and the security, because when you're going from a private network into the cloud, into public internet, there are a lot more risks involved.
And there's another good point on that, which just, again, big picture business issue, right? And I'll use this Buffett analogy. It's in the early part of last century, right? There were at certain points in time 2,000 auto manufacturers. That's a fact, 2,000. And now there's 3. At one point there was 5 million horses. Now there's 500,000 horses. So the question is, which SD-WAN provider winds up surviving, which doesn't? What you want to do is you want to short horses, right? I mean, really, that's the answer to the question. So how does that whole play into this conversation? And that's a great business conversation with clients, which goes into this, let's wait a little bit if we don't need to do it for a reason, because you use, what did VHS win? Many people thought that Sony had a better technology, but the reality is VHS won because
Partnerships.
Correct, and they put it on any box, and so it was less expensive. So you could have a great technology. So that's another big picture business question that's out there, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing most folks saying, is it CapEx? Is it OpEx? What do we do if this? What do we do? How do we get out if there's a problem? And again, it's risk management. So I agree with that.
We could go on for quite a bit on this.
Well, hang on. I just want to go, because the UCAS is the next one?
Security's next.
Security. Because I was about to say, that's the same thing with the UCAS.
Yeah,
I mean, look at how many UCAS providers there are. I heard a statistic that there are only 125 UCAS providers that have revenues of over $5 million a month. Do you know how many UCAS providers there are out there? I mean, I know. So who's going to win?
Everybody's an entrepreneur.
Yep. So,
Okay.
Sorry.
I do want to get to security because I think it's a really important topic for everybody, right? Everyone has to have an answer for security. How do you start that conversation with your clients that you're seeing? What are they asking you, and what's the answer?
The simple question is, what keeps you up at night, especially after a Target incident happens? I mean, that's when everybody starts calling, is when there's something big that happens and they say, oh, we've got to talk about security. They have this panic attack.
Sure.
And most of our partners have no clue where to even begin with what are the basic 3 or 4 questions to ask. And once again, they pull into the ecosystem. They go to somebody that, I'm not the expert, I'm going to pull in somebody to do it. There are companies like CenturyLink that have very sophisticated but high cost security. And then there's other organizations that are providing, basic good security at a much more reasonable cost. customers have no idea, and they're terrified.
Yeah.
Well, interestingly, again, it starts with the business conversation. What's the goal? Because when you talk about some of the big providers, if at the end of the day, the client says, if something were to happen, and it very well may, I need air cover to be able to say that I'm, parachuting in this group of experts in, from an incident response perspective, then you go to a big player because they give that kind of overflight. And if they're going to do that, it makes sense for them to do penetration testing. But if you start with something like penetration testing, that large provider is going to be twice as expensive as a smaller VAR. So I think you need to start at the back and work your way forward with, again, simple questions like that, and then, again, bring in the most appropriate person. Because what you don't want to do, right, is client comes and says, hey, listen, who does penetration testing? Well, everybody does penetration testing. So then you go to a big provider, and then they go out and get their own quote, and you're 2x, you've hurt your credibility. So I think it will be important to understand where the different players in the space fit in that ecosystem and why people are doing business with them so that you can get the most appropriate person in. And I think there's a place for both these smaller, dedicated shops as well as the large providers.
But the thing with security is that oftentimes when you go in and you have somebody do a security assessment, they give you back a bill, and it is such sticker shock that the customer's like, there's no way I'll be able to get this approved. So then they start to think about, well, okay, what is really their risk? And I have had CIOs and CTOs tell me, I'm going to take the money every single month and stick it in the bank because I feel that, and just make sure I'm doing the basic stuff because I can't afford to do the type of security system that you're recommending. I mean, it's ridiculously expensive for a lot of customers. So they're balancing out what it is that how much risk do they really think they're at?
Yeah, when it comes to security, it's a little bit like if the three of us are walking in the woods and a bear comes and attacks us. I don't have to run faster than the bear. I just have to run faster than one of you.
And if I'm in heels, you walk.
I would disagree a little bit because unfortunately, like if you look at the statistics between China, the United States, and Russia,
Yep.
Everybody big and small is it's a pack of it's wolves.
It is.
Right.
I mean, everyone's being hit, so it needs to be addressed on some level to whatever that might be. And again, businesses are going to assess their own risk and do what they need to do.
Yeah.
I do think that you're 100% right. Folks come in and say, okay, Miss or Mr. Small Business, like you give me $5 million and I'll make sure that you're secure. And by the way, you're gonna have to give me another $3 million next year because the world changed. That's inappropriate for the situation. So I think the business will evolve into something that's a little bit more palatable. But even in security, everyone's scared of the liability. So I didn't tell you to do this, or I didn't push you hard enough, and now all of a sudden you're going to come after me. Just kind of, that's the world we live in right now. So I think that's a big challenge associated with it.
And there's power in statistics too, right? I mean, most of the attacks are successful because of human error on
That's
the side
exactly
of the
what I was about to say. The biggest factor is a human. We can't.
Right. So
How much risk can you prevent that?
Right, but you can do there's certain hygiene that you can do, like make sure your password procedures are correct, make sure that you're patching properly, and have somebody in the company who's responsible for auditing that and knowing it and knowing that it's been done. And then you start to layer on some other skill. This is running faster than the other guys in the room, right? If you're at least that hard to get at, it does help.
Right.
Absolutely.
It's like putting an alarm system in. That just makes it a little. The robbers go to the people who don't have the alarm system.
Yeah, it's definitely the case though that if you won't keep the worst of the bad guys, you won't keep out.
Right.
So you're trying
Someone
to.
wants to break down their door. They're going to break down your door. If you leave your door open, someone might walk in.
Well, but it's not even. Yes, you have to worry about China and Russia, but it's also the 21-year-old who's trying to do it for the thrills, just to see if they can get in and get all this credit card information just because.
Okay. All right, so we just have a couple of minutes left, and I want, great conversation. We could obviously go at this for a couple more hours on virtually dozens of topics. But piece of advice. You're both very successful in your businesses. What piece of advice would you give partners on how to up their game, the thing that they should think about doing?
I'm going to give another analogy here, right? Most of us have been building relationships with clients for decades, right? And there are a lot of shiny objects out there, you know? And it's really easy to start running around chasing those shiny objects. The reality is we've all built castles, which are relationships and MRR. And I think my advice would be build a moat around that castle. Okay, make it difficult for the barbarians who are walking by so that they don't come in and sack that castle. And the barbarians are everybody who's trying to sell something into your business. So form partnerships, right? Stick with your clients, have great conversations, and bring in folks that you trust, right? Because it's you know, you got to connect the dots in order to have those great conversations. Because if you continue to have those great conversations, what will happen is your revenue will continue to increase, even though we're in a market where the unit cost of everything is decreasing because we're getting more of the spend. So in theory, running out and I see people, well, I'm going to build an IoT practice from scratch and all of those other things, you know, that's fine if you have your clients locked down and you've established that makes sense, but make sure that you're having the conversations that you should with your clients and build those moats around it, because at the end of the day, that's what is, you know, paying all of our salaries.
30 seconds.
Okay, ecosystem. Build your ecosystem. I think that you're the internist. You need to know who your specialists are. You need to educate yourself so that you are able to understand what your clients' needs are and be able to pull in the right specialist.
Thank you very much. I encourage everybody to go up to the keynotes after this. Gabriella Schuster from Microsoft will be the featured speaker. We're pretty smart. She's brilliant. So go hear Gabriella. Thank you very much, panelists.